I still remember the first time I felt the cracks forming in what I believed was an unshakable marriage. I was sitting in our living room in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Austin, Texas, watching a rerun of some old sitcom. My wife, Olivia, was in the kitchen, fiddling with her phone, her voice hushed as she whispered into it. I strained my ears to make out the conversation, but all I could gather was the sense that she didn't want me to hear a single word. That was the first red flag. I had known Olivia for over 10 years, and we had been married for 5. She was 32, and I was 34. Yet, something in her manner felt alien. I tried to rationalize my suspicions. I told myself that perhaps she was planning a surprise for me or chatting with an old friend. But the late-night text messages, the way she became guarded with her phone, always keeping it face down or slipping it into her purse, made me realize it was more than a harmless secret. My anxiety started simmering under the surface, and whenever I dared question her, she would snap back defensively. Still, I clung to hope. After all, we had built a life together. I came from a family shattered decades ago when my father disappeared, leaving my mother and me alone. It was something I had never fully healed from, but I had told myself that if I ever got married, I would do everything to avoid a broken home. Olivia and I had big dreams, buying our own house, starting a family, and building the kind of stability I'd never had as a child. The worry gnawed at me day and night. My job as a software developer wasn't stressful, but I found myself making mistakes, losing focus, constantly distracted by the notion that my wife might be hiding something. At first, I blamed my own paranoia. Maybe I was overreacting. But when she came home late from work one evening, smelling faintly of expensive cologne that definitely wasn't mine, a new dread took root. I confronted her gently that night, asking if she was working extra hours. She dodged the question, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and hurried off to take a shower. She had never been much of a liar in the past, at least, not to my knowledge, but something told me this web of secrecy was growing bigger every day. I watched her from the corner of my eye, noticing how she typed away at her phone in the dead of night or how she'd excuse herself to the patio to answer a call. My heart sank when I realized she wasn't even trying to hide it that well anymore. It was as if a part of her wanted me to notice. Sleepless nights became the norm for me. Instead of drifting off next to my wife, I'd lie awake, thinking about my father and how he had disappeared without a trace. Was betrayal in my bloodline? Was this the universe's cruel way of reminding me that some bonds just aren't meant to last? I decided at first to keep my concerns to myself. Maybe I could save the marriage by ignoring the warning signs. But denial only goes so far. Soon, her behavior eroded every last shred of normalcy in our home. I found myself on edge all the time, jumping whenever the phone rang, noticing how quickly she'd silence her notifications or the way she kept her phone locked with a fresh passcode I didn't know. What alarmed me most was the emotional distance. Olivia spoke to me less and less. When I tried to connect with her, she'd roll her eyes or feign exhaustion. On rare occasions we did talk, I felt like I was speaking to a stranger. The woman I married, warm, compassionate, and lively, was replaced by an aloof, guarded version of herself. It was then that I knew our foundation was crumbling beneath my feet. I just didn't realize how deep the cracks went. I reached my breaking point one evening when Olivia came home 3 hours later than usual. She strode in, tossed her purse on the table, and headed straight for the bathroom without so much as a hello. My anger was boiling over, but I decided to keep calm. I needed answers, not a screaming match. Once she emerged, I was waiting for her in the living room, my arms folded over my chest. "Olivia," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and dread, "we need to talk." She gave me a cold look. "I'm tired. Can we do this tomorrow?" "No," I snapped. "We're doing it now." She sighed, and the way she sank onto the couch told me that something monumental was about to happen. I demanded she explain herself, her late nights, her secretive phone calls, the stench of someone else's cologne. For a moment, she looked defiant, like she might deny everything. But then something in her cracked, and she exhaled a heavy breath. "I've been seeing someone else," she said flatly, as if it were a mere business transaction. My heart thundered in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. When I finally found my voice, all I could ask was, "Who?" She refused to give me a name at first. All she would say was that he was older, wealthy, and understood her better than I did. The knife twisted deeper. I felt nauseous as I imagined some aging playboy showering her with gifts and attention while she grew colder and colder toward me. "How long?" I demanded, though part of me didn't want the answer. "Long enough," she replied, refusing to meet my eyes. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to steady myself. A horrifying montage of images flashed through my mind, her at fancy restaurants, in expensive cars, draped in jewelry that I could never afford. I wanted to shout, to break something, to rage against the betrayal. But I held myself together, if only barely. Then came the final blow. "I want a divorce," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The words felt like a punch to the gut. A swirling storm of rage, sorrow, and disbelief threatened to consume me. I thought of all the promises we'd made on our wedding day, that we'd stand by each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. Yet here she was, throwing everything away for some older man with deep pockets. My mind flickered to memories of my father, who'd done something similar, vanishing from our lives, leaving me and my mother to fend for ourselves. I sank into the armchair, numbness spreading through my limbs. If she wanted me to break down or beg her to stay, she'd be disappointed. There was a coldness in my chest where my heart used to be. After everything, she just said, an uncharacteristic clarity took hold. I would not go quietly into that good night. "So that's it?" I said, voice quavering. "Just like that, you're done with me?" She didn't answer immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. Finally, she lifted her gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though it sounded hollow. "We want different things. I can't do this anymore." A swirl of conflicting emotions flooded my mind, love, hate, regret, longing. But beyond all that, one thought crystallized: I wasn't going to just let her walk away unscathed. If she wanted a divorce, to run off with some rich old man, fine. But she'd soon learn that my anger and sense of betrayal weren't to be underestimated. That very night, I resolved that I would uncover every secret, and eventually, she would pay the price for what she'd done. Reeling from Olivia's confession, I knew I needed tangible proof of her betrayal, evidence that would not only confirm the affair but also help me in the inevitable divorce proceedings. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. Her name was Mia Carter, a former detective turned freelance PI with a reputation for getting results. When I explained my situation, Mia listened intently, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took notes. She didn't ask many questions, but her calm demeanor gave me a strange sense of reassurance. Within days, Mia began feeding me snippets of intelligence, phone logs, suspicious credit card charges at upscale restaurants, and glimpses of Olivia visiting neighborhoods well outside her usual haunts. My initial heartbreak morphed into a cold fury. Every time I looked at the new photos or read Mia's surveillance notes, I felt more resolved to see this through to the bitter end. One day, Mia called me. "I've got something," she said. "Meet me at my office." I hurried over, my mind racing with anticipation. If she was summoning me in person, it had to be big. Her office was a small, unassuming space in downtown Austin, tucked away in a building that looked like it had seen better days. Mia handed me a folder filled with photographs of Olivia stepping out of a sleek black limousine. Standing beside the car was an older man, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, leaning on a cane but exuding an air of confidence. The two of them walked hand in hand into a sprawling mansion, complete with iron gates and a circular driveway lined with expensive cars. "Who is he?" I asked, flipping through the photos. "Still working on that," Mia replied. "He goes by the name Mr. Harrison on some official documents, but I've discovered it's likely an alias. I'm still tracking his real identity. He's definitely wealthy, possibly new money, and your wife seems pretty comfortable around him." Her words felt like shards of glass in my chest. Mia went on to describe how Olivia visited him 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes even more. She stayed for hours. The staff at the mansion seemed to know her by name, greeting her with polite bows and holding doors open like she was royalty. "Any sign that she's bringing anything out of the house? Money, jewelry, gifts?" I asked, my mind swirling with questions about what she might be planning to stash away before filing for divorce. Mia shook her head. "Not yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if that comes next. She appears to leave empty-handed. Whatever is going on inside is discreet." I left Mia's office that day with a determination sharper than ever. I was no stranger to heartbreak. My father's disappearance had taught me how betrayal by a loved one can shatter your world. But this time, I wouldn't be the victim. I was going to take charge, play offense. If Olivia and her wealthy old lover thought they could make me look like a fool, they would soon realize I was nobody's doormat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pored over the photos, memorizing every detail of that mansion and the older man's face. My imagination conjured endless scenarios. Maybe he showered her with gifts, or they shared candlelit dinners in lavish dining rooms. The images fueled my anger but also ignited a grim sense of purpose. She wanted to be with a rich old man? Fine. But she'd learned that illusions of grandeur could shatter just as easily as any vow. I immediately called my lawyer, initiating the steps to ensure I'd be protected in any legal battle. I also asked Mia to dig deeper, find out the real identity behind Mr. Harrison. My wife's betrayal felt like a cold shock to the system, but the knowledge that I had a plan, that I was gathering weapons in the form of information, sustained me. Sooner or later, I'd confront them both, and when that moment came, I'd make sure neither of them would ever forget what it felt like to cross me. Armed with Mia's latest findings, I decided it was time to strike. I couldn't stand lurking in the shadows any longer. If Olivia was brazen enough to flaunt her affair in a place like that mansion, then I'd show up unannounced and let the chips fall where they may. After all, confronting them face to face might force them to reveal more than they intended. The drive to the mansion felt excruciatingly long, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The estate was nestled in a posh neighborhood in the hills of Austin, far removed from the modest suburbs where Olivia and I lived. Towering gates stood at the entrance, monitored by a security camera. My heart pounded as I pulled up, unsure how I'd even get in. To my surprise, the gates swung open as if expecting me. At first, I wondered if Mia had somehow arranged it, but she'd given no indication of that. Regardless, I drove up the winding driveway until I reached a circular courtyard adorned with a grand fountain. Servants dressed in black suits were already waiting. One stepped forward and opened my car door, greeting me with a nod. "Mr. Carter, correct?" the servant asked. There was no judgment or hesitation in his voice, just a polite acknowledgement. I was too stunned to question how he knew my name. He led me through the main entrance into a cavernous foyer, shimmering with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Every corner of the place screamed opulence. As I walked in, my emotions waged war inside me: anger, apprehension, curiosity. There was no sign of Olivia yet. Another servant escorted me into a large living room with plush sofas and panoramic windows overlooking a manicured garden. I stood there, scanning the room, half expecting to see my wife curled up on a couch with her aging paramour. Instead, an older man walked in, silver hair combed back, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, leaning on a polished cane. My pulse quickened. This had to be the man in Mia's photographs. He inclined his head in greeting, a faint smile on his lips. "Mr. Carter, I've been expecting you," he said calmly. "I'm Henry Harrison. Please, have a seat." My jaw tightened. "Where's Olivia?" "She'll be along soon," he replied, settling into a chair across from me. "But first, there is someone else who'd like to speak with you." Confusion washed over me. Someone else? My eyes flickered toward the door, and that's when he stepped in, an older figure, the edges of his hair graying but with unmistakable features that mirrored my own. My heartbeat thundered as recognition dawned on me. Memories of childhood summers at the beach, baseball games, and that haunting day he vanished all flooded back in an instant. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My father, who disappeared 30 years ago without a trace, was standing right in front of me. Alive. The blood drained from my face as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. How was this possible? He stepped forward, looking me in the eye for the first time in decades. "It's me, son," he said quietly. "I know this is a shock." "A shock?" I spat, anger flaring. "You left me and Mom with no explanation. You've been gone for 30 years. What are you doing here? How do you know him?" I jerked my head toward Harrison. My father took a measured breath. "Because I hired him." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Hired him? For what?" Just then, Olivia appeared in the doorway, wearing a worried expression. She froze, clearly taken aback by my presence. My father continued, "Because I needed to see if she was truly loyal to you. And I needed to see what kind of man you'd become." It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My mind whirled as I tried to process the layers of betrayal and deception. My wife had cheated on me with a man who was hired by my own father, the same man who'd vanished from my life 3 decades ago. And that was only the tip of the iceberg. Silence engulfed the living room for what felt like an eternity. My father and Henry Harrison, who was just a hired player in this twisted game, stood calmly, waiting for my reaction. Meanwhile, Olivia seemed frozen between outrage and fear, her gaze darting from me to them, trying to figure out her next move. I finally found my voice, though it trembled with anger. "What the hell is going on? You've been gone for 30 years, Dad, and now you're telling me you orchestrated this entire affair to test my wife?" He nodded, his demeanor unsettlingly composed. "When I left, it was for reasons I can't fully disclose right now. But in my years away, I managed to build a life, a fortune. I kept tabs on you, wanted to ensure you were safe. Once you got married, I had my suspicions about Olivia. She struck me as opportunistic." "You had no right," I erupted, taking a step forward. My hands shook. "You left us. Mom died heartbroken, and you think you can just show up and reveal you've been secretly spying on me?" I could see his jaw tighten. "I know I've made mistakes. But let's not pretend Olivia isn't in the wrong here." She fell right into Henry's lap the moment he showed her a little glitz and glamour. My eyes darted to Olivia. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was obvious she had been blindsided too, discovering that Henry wasn't some genuine billionaire admirer but a hired operative. She looked lost, regret flickering in her eyes. I wasn't sure if her regret was about hurting me or getting caught in such a colossal lie. Henry cleared his throat. "Let me explain my part. I was paid by your father to get close to Olivia, discreetly, of course. We knew from the start that it might destroy your marriage if she took the bait." He shrugged, almost apologetic. "It wasn't personal." My breath came in ragged bursts. "Not personal? You seduced my wife and destroyed my life, all because you were on my father's payroll?" "That's not fair," Olivia interjected, her voice strained. "I had a choice. I She trailed off, tears forming in her eyes. It was too late for tears. She tried to approach me, but I backed away. Fury bubbled inside me like molten lava. I couldn't decide who I despised more, my father for engineering this twisted scheme or Olivia for so readily jumping into it. My father took a hesitant step forward. "Son, I'm sorry about the pain this caused you. But I needed to be sure. You come from a legacy, one I had to abandon for reasons I'll explain someday. I've watched you grow, and I had to know if your wife was worthy of what I planned to leave you." "Worthy?" I barked out a humorless laugh. "So you break up my marriage just to see if she's gold-digging scum? News flash, you succeeded. Now she wants a divorce. Congratulations." Olivia's voice trembled. It wasn't just about money. I was unhappy. Her voice caught. He listened to me. "You were always so distant, so afraid, like you were haunted by your father's disappearance." Her words stabbed at a place I'd always tried to protect. Yes, my father's vanishing act had left scars, but that didn't justify her betrayal. I looked at her, then at my father, feeling an overwhelming need to lash out at both of them. The room buzzed with tension. Finally, I drew in a shaky breath, forcing a sense of calm over my raging emotions. "You said you wanted a divorce," I said to Olivia, my voice cold. "Fine. Let's go down that path. But don't think for a second you'll walk away from this without consequences. You have no idea what I'm capable of." A flicker of fear crossed her face. She likely assumed I'd let her walk away with half of everything we owned, or more. Not this time. If my father was as wealthy as he claimed, and if he was looking to make amends, then maybe I'd have the resources to make sure her betrayal would leave her with nothing but regret. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers. As soon as I left the mansion, I headed straight for my lawyer's office, fueled by rage and supported by the newfound knowledge of my father's resources. I was determined to ensure Olivia got as little as legally possible in the divorce. I wasn't above using every scrap of evidence, from Mia's photo dossier to the confessions made in front of me, to prove adultery and malicious intent. While the paperwork churned through the system, I went a step further. Through my father's network of associates, I orchestrated a series of quiet whispers in our social circle, letting everyone know exactly why Olivia and I were splitting, that she had been seduced by the lure of an old man's supposed wealth, that she had toyed with my trust and decided I wasn't enough for her. Overnight, her social standing plummeted. Friends who once invited her for brunch or weekend getaways now kept their distance, either out of loyalty to me or simple fear of involvement in the scandal. Meanwhile, my father insisted we talk. He apologized for the subterfuge, sort of. Though part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, another part wanted answers. Why did he really leave? How had he amassed such wealth? And why show up now? We met in a quiet diner off the highway, far from prying eyes. He admitted that he'd left to protect us from dangerous people he'd gotten involved with in his youth. He swore it was the only way to keep me and my mother safe. I wasn't fully convinced, but I could see the remorse etched on his features. Despite my lingering anger, I found a strange sense of relief in the knowledge that he'd at least thought of me all those years. It didn't excuse his absence, but it meant my entire childhood hadn't been a lie. He offered to help me rebuild, financially, emotionally, whatever I needed. He wanted a second chance at being a father, now that the coast was supposedly clear from the threats of the past. I took his help, primarily to strengthen my case against Olivia. With my father's lawyers and mine working together, we swiftly proved her adultery and documented her attempts to siphon funds from our joint account after she'd started the affair. The settlement negotiations were brutal. She tried to play the victim card, but every time she turned around, we had more evidence to disprove her claims. In the end, she left with barely a fraction of what she might have gotten otherwise. The day the divorce was finalized was surreal. Olivia showed up looking gaunt, her eyes ringed with dark circles. She'd lost the lustrous shine she once flaunted so boldly. Standing opposite me in the courthouse, she tried to catch my eye, maybe in a final bid for sympathy. I stared through her, expression unyielding. When the judge pronounced the marriage officially over, I felt a wave of cold satisfaction. My revenge was complete. In the aftermath, I learned Olivia's old man, Henry Harrison, had disappeared back into the shadows. His job done, he faded from her life like smoke. She found herself alone, scorned by former friends, burdened with a tarnished reputation, and facing a new reality with almost no financial cushion. A far cry from the glamorous future she'd envisioned. As for me, I slowly pieced together a tenuous relationship with my father. It wasn't easy. We had 3 decades worth of questions, anger, and missed milestones to reconcile. But something in me, maybe that wounded little boy who lost his dad, clung to the idea that we could forge a new bond. Over coffee one morning, he handed me a set of keys to a property he owned. "A gift," he said. "To help you start over." I took the keys, realizing that, in an odd, twisted way, his scheme had laid bare the truth of my marriage. Yes, it was a cruel method, but I was free of a woman who only wanted a bigger slice of the American dream than I could offer. I was no longer haunted by the question of whether Olivia truly loved me. She made her choice, and she paid the price. Now, standing on the precipice of a new life, I can't say I'm grateful for the pain. But I can say I'm stronger for having endured it. Betrayal has a way of sharpening one's resolve, and if nothing else, I learned that sometimes family is complicated beyond measure, but it can also be the key to unlocking a future you never imagined.